Welcome back once again to CBSE Board Economics. I'm Saddam Hussain here. Today we discuss another very important concept in microeconomics. We have been discussing about indifference curve analysis. You learned it, what is an indifference schedule. You know it, what is an indifference curve. You have seen is indifference map. Today we discuss in detail, a bit of it we discussed in earlier question when we were talking about what is an indifference curve. Now today we discuss about what are an exclusive question, what are the properties of an indifference curve. That's an important question. Maybe from your exam point of view, it might come for 6 marks, not 3, 4, 6 marks, write all the points. But the most important points are 3. What is an indifference curve? What are its properties? An indifference curve, already you learned, an indifference curve shows different possible combination of two commodities that gives the consumer equal satisfaction. An indifference curve shows different possible combination of two commodities that gives the consumer equal level of satisfaction. So let's see the properties of indifference curve. The first property you have, the first property is, look at the graph, an indifference curve always slopes downwards. It's always sloping downwards. Why does it slope downwards? Because if the consumer is buying more of good X, he has to sacrifice good Y. Why he has to sacrifice good Y? There are two reasons behind it. Number one, he is constrained by his income because he has limited income. So he has to sacrifice. Only when you give up good Y, you will be in a position to buy up more of good X. The second reason, if he does not sacrifice good Y, if he is increasing the consumption of good X, so then the level of satisfaction from the subsequent combinations will be more than the previous one, which is contrary to the assumption of indifference curves. So the first point you got it, an indifference curve always slopes downwards. Why it slopes downwards? Because if the consumer consumes more of good X, he has to sacrifice good Y. Two reasons. Number one, to maintain the same level of satisfaction. Number two, he is constrained by his income. The second point is, look at this one, an indifference curve is always convex to the origin. Always convex to the origin. Why it is convex to the origin? Because of decreasing MRS, marginal rate of substitution. An indifference curve is always convex to the origin because of decreasing MRS. What is MRS? It is the rate of sacrifice of one commodity in order to obtain one more unit of the other commodity. Why MRS is decreasing? Because of law of diminishing marginality. When the consumer goes on consuming more and more units of good X, he is sacrificing good Y at lesser and lesser rate because his marginality from good X is decreasing. First he gave up 4 of Y, then he gave up 2 of Y, then he gave up only 1 of Y to obtain good X. So that is why it is convex to the origin. An indifference curve is convex to the origin. And the next most important point, the first point is downward sloping, second point is convex to the origin. Another most important point, of course this is not in the graph, I'll show you separately. Two indifference curves never intersect each other. Two indifference curves never intersect each other. Why they never intersect each other? Because at the point of intersection, both the curves will give you equal satisfaction, which is not possible. Imagine in your mind, IC1 and IC2 are intersecting. At the point of intersection, both the curves give you equal satisfaction, which is contrary to the assumption of indifference curve. IC2 definitely will give you more satisfaction than IC1, which is not possible. So the first point, an indifference curve slopes downwards. Second point, an indifference curve is always convex to the origin. The third point, two indifference curves can never intersect each other. The now sidey points, some important points you have, they're not so important, but remember, if it comes for 6 marks, write it. An indifference curve can never be parallel to x-axis, can never be parallel to axis. Why it can never be parallel? Because if it's parallel to x-axis, that means you go on increasing more and more of x commodity without sacrificing y. It can never be parallel to axis, that means you're buying more of y without sacrificing x, which is contrary to the assumption of indifference curves. We go constrained by your income. So remember, an indifference curve can never be parallel to x-axis, can never be parallel to y-axis. The next point you have, an indifference curve can never touch the x-axis or y-axis. If it's touching the x-axis, that means you are buying only good x, none of good y, which is contrary to the assumption of indifference curve. It never touches the y-axis because that's also contrary to the assumption of indifference curve. You are buying only good y. That means you are not buying. So simply 6 points. So the most important are 3. An indifference curve slopes downwards. Number 2, an indifference curve is always convex to the origin. Number 3, two indifference curves never intersect each other. Number 4, an indifference curve can never be parallel to x-axis. Number 5, an indifference curve can never be parallel to y-axis. Number 6, an indifference curve can never touch the x-axis. Number 7, an indifference curve never touch the y-axis. So I'll read it out for your convenience here. So what are the properties of indifference curves? So the first property is an indifference curve slopes downwards from left to right. Look at the graph. Any point or combination of two goods on the same indifference curve give equal satisfaction and utility to the consumer. Hence the consumer is negatively sloped. Hence the IC curve is negatively sloped, because if he consumes more of good X, he has to sacrifice the consumption of good Y to have the same level of satisfaction. Number 2, an indifference curve is convex to the origin. An indifference curve is convex to the origin because of decreasing marginal rate of substitution. It is because of the law of diminishing marginal utility. I read the third point. Two indifference curves never intersect each other, because at the point of intersection, both the curves give equal satisfaction to the consumer, which contradicts the assumption that higher indifference curves give higher satisfaction. Now these 3 are important points. Now you have another 3 points which are not so important. Higher indifference curve represents, okay, this point is important. Higher indifference curve represents higher level of satisfaction. This is because of the assumption that preferences are monotonic and more quantity consumed means more utility. Higher indifference curve represents more quantity of goods. This is also important point. Number 1, downward sloping. Number 2, convex to the origin. Number 3, two indifference curves never intersect each other. Number 4, higher indifference curves will give you higher level of satisfaction. An indifference curve neither touches the x-axis nor y-axis because of the assumption that the consumer has to consume a combination of both the goods. Next point, an indifference curve is neither parallel to x-axis nor parallel to y-axis because if the consumer consumes more of one good, he has to sacrifice some units of the other good. So these are the properties. So I hope you understood it. The first property is, remember, 4 very important properties. Number 1, it is downward sloping. Number 2, an IC is always convex to the origin. Number 3, two indifference curves never intersect each other. Number 4, higher the indifference curve, higher will be the level of